Okay, well, I think we can get started. Well, good afternoon. Let me start off by welcome you all to this session at the Center for Global Development as part of the program of events that we have this week around the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. And I want to also welcome those of you who are joining us through the live stream and remind you that if you would like to send any questions, please do so, and we will try to answer them in the session when we get to the participation from the audience. But before that, I just want to say a word about topic. You know, when we first floated this theme of aid effectiveness for one of the sessions, I think it's fair to say that there were some groans and sort of words to the effect of, isn't this really sort of very last century? I mean, why are we doing this? And the sort of arguments that people had were, well, look, I mean, development is so much more than aid, and even our own commitment to development index that CGD puts out talks about a variety of things, not just aid and financial flows, and even within financial flows, aren't aid flows sort of really quite a small part of the total flows? So other things matter more, and then there's a sort of thing around, well, to the extent that we use aid, don't we use it for so many different things now, for climate, for security, and it's not really sensible to think about aid effectiveness in the same way. And finally, that there's a whole new set of players, particularly China, but not only China, in this in development finance, and they don't really think about aid and relationships in the same way. So there's this sort of body of views that sort of says, look, really, it's time to move on beyond these principles. I don't know how many people in this audience actually remember the Paris Declaration of 2005. Some veterans are nodding their heads, and others who have been looking at historical documents sort of are doing that. But it was a time when we were all getting very excited about sort of the Paris Declaration, Accra, Busan, and in fact, Satu just reminded me, even before that, Rome, 2003. I don't hear very much about them these days. And so we thought we would sort of have this session today to really talk about, is it time to just move on, declare victory? Is it time to think differently about aid effectiveness? So we could take the view that aid effectiveness is still important, but just needs to be thought about in different ways? Or is it time to sort of say, no, it's actually, it is important, the way we think about it is the right way, and we just need to keep banging on the drum about making sure that people hear more loudly that we need to be effective. So you can come out in sort of very different perspectives. And I'm interested to hear sort of where our panelists are going to come out on that. And we have sort of quite diverse perspectives in the panel. And actually, we have, I wanted to start, in fact, with Ibrahim al-Badawi, the recently become Minister of Finance and Economy in the Sudan. So here's a country that's actually looking forward to re-engaging with the international development community and probably be getting a fair amount of concessional assistance going forward. So it'd be good to get his perspective on how he thinks about these things, especially because in his previous life, he's actually been looking at many of these issues from the sort of academic end. So it'd be good to get that perspective. Then we have three different donor perspectives, if I can call them that. So the UK, the world's third largest aid provider now. Finland, which is actually the current president of the European Council, and EU institutions are, again, big time providers of development assistance, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which not only provides finance, but also provides support for thinking about development issues. And in the interest of full disclosure, I should say, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is also one of the supporters of the Center for Global Development's work on a number of areas. And then I think to sort of round it off, we thought we'd ask one of CGD's senior policy fellows, Ian Mitchell, sitting there, and who's been directing the work on the redesign of our commitment to development index, also looking at aid effectiveness to sort of bring us more of a analyst perspective, a research perspective on these issues. So that's kind of the plan, and then we will open it out, and I'm sure many of you have views on this topic, so we will look forward to hearing those. And if at the end of those you actually have a question mark, that's even better, because then the panelists might be able to respond to it. So, shall I turn to you, Ibrahim? You know, you are now, as I said, a minister, an economist, a think tank before that. So, how do you think about aid quality? Is it something you think about at all? And if so, in what way do you think we should think about it?
Well, thank you very much, Masoud, and for the opportunity to share, to listen and to share my views on this. I think this is continues to be a very important topic for development. But having now joined the government and only for 1 month and a few days, I think my broad perspective that looked at issues as relatively abstract, like the Dutch disease effect of aid and competitiveness of the exchange rate. Now I think I'm thinking much more kind of about immediate things, such as, for example, in a situation like my country, coming after a regime that ruled for 30 years and managed to destroy the capacity and the welfare of the population, the constituency, Sudanese people, they actually now look for some very basic things, such as the timeliness of delivery of services to deal with issues such as shortages in electric power generation, issues related to quality of health services, traffic jams and problems of transport and things like that. That's why I think in terms of our debate and engagement with the Friends of Sudan, the body that was recently formed after the revolution in Sudan, is to actually see if you could get bilateral donors who have hopefully instruments that are more responsive in terms of timeliness of delivery than the multilaterals, who actually have to go through a more elaborate process and grapple with big issues like fiscal, for example, policy reforms and monetary and exchange rate issues and broad institutional restructuring and so on. And I think this is one area that I can see it now for us in Sudan, that the aid effectiveness, aside from the traditional issues that we are accustomed to deal with, is how the bilateral and the NGOs on one hand complement or design their role to complement the multilateral institutions. And I think this is for us is really very important.
Thank you very much. Matthew, may I turn to you next? And David, of course, has led a lot of work on aid effectiveness, but your own work and your own funding profile is sort of evolving as the needs evolve. And it'd be interesting to get a sense of what that means for the way in which you and your colleagues are thinking about it.
Well, thank you, Masoud, and thank you to the CGD for convening this panel and inviting me onto it, and also for your leadership on this and so many other parts of the development agenda. And it's great to join this distinguished panel. So I thought there were 3 Ps that I might talk about, which is the purpose of development spending, the principles, and then the practices. So on the purpose, I think absolutely nothing has changed since 2003 or 2005, whenever we want to start this journey. The purpose of development spending is to end poverty. The way that we think about ending poverty might have shifted, might have broadened out, just as the MDGs have turned into the SDGs. So we think now not just about tackling the symptoms of poverty, like governments in partner countries that are not rich enough to afford their own services in health or education or whatever, and thinking much more about the underlying causes of poverty, including climate change, including conflict, including poor governance and so on. And if you think of it like that, then I think there's absolutely no change at all in terms of the underlying principle about what is good development all about. Sorry, the underlying purpose of what is good development all about. The principles, secondly, seem to me to be only partially relevant still. I mean, a lot of good stuff is in those the Paris principles and the Busan principles. But they don't feel wholly fit for purpose in this day and age, if I could be honest about it. And I think we should think about creating a new set in order to allow us to do development differently, as we do need to do in order to meet the sort of challenges that the world is throwing at us. And I would have thought we would want to absolutely retain, or if anything, even enhance the voice within those principles of the receiving country. So it was great to have the Minister from Sudan here, for instance. But also perhaps update our concepts of accountability. I mean, I spend a huge amount of time thinking about accountability to the UK Parliament and through them to the UK people, given that the money that DFID spends is UK taxpayers' money. And so having an updated sort of sense of what that looks like in the principles might be very welcome. And then thirdly and finally, if we think about the principles about how we all do development, that has changed hugely, I would say, since 2005 or whenever, and I expect that will need to carry on changing too. And in some ways, it will need to carry on changing away from the sort of top-down, rather static approach, which I think is inherent in the original principles. We have to be much more flexible about how we do stuff, much more adaptive in our programming, much more entrepreneurial in trying stuff out in one place, and if it works, great, let's scale it up and do it everywhere. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. As long as we know quickly that it doesn't work, we can stop it quickly and try something out. That sort of approach doesn't seem to really fit with the existing principles. And the other thing to say is there are so many different indexes or indices of aid effectiveness that I think any one of them has sort of slightly lost its power. Certainly whenever there's a new one that comes out now and the UK or DFID is lower on it than we would like to be, the answer from all of my team is not, oh my God, we better do something different. It's, there's something wrong with the methodology. And the most recent one, where I must say my teams had a point, I think, was that we were scoring less well on use of government systems than we previously were, simply because we're not doing general budget support anymore. But I think that's a good shift out of general budget support. And if that somehow means that we score poorly on one or other of these indexes, then probably we should be changing the methodology.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I think we'll come back to some of those points, I'm sure, in the conversation. Satya, could I turn to you and sort of get a bit your perspective on this set of issues?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is it's interesting that we are debating this topic, and I think it's good that we don't sort of let it just die a death or be forgotten. I know that many of us sort of our eyes glaze over when we start rambling through the acronyms and processes and dates and this and that. But I think, as Matthew said, I think the purpose and the core of what this agenda is all about continues to be relevant. I mean, if we think about, we all know that when development cooperation supports and pursues partner countries' own development priorities, results tend to be better. We know that if priorities are agreed in an inclusive and equitable national process with different stakeholders participating, it does bring better results. And when external support is coordinated with domestic efforts, it tends to be better. But where I think we kind of maybe have made mistakes is that the agenda has become too heavy, too maybe theoretical, and sometimes a lot of focus on how, as donors tend to often do, a lot of focus on process and getting organized around it. Where I think at the country level, where we are trying to help things happening, I think that's where we really would have needed to focus more on, and then build that kind of flexibility that Matthew was also talking about. So we continue to think in Finland that these principles are valid, but I think into we fall into the middle category that we do need to think about them a little differently, and in particular implement differently and be more practical about it. One area where we think we could take advantage of, and that's in the results area. If we worked more SDG focused and sort of thought about the SDGs as a common framework for our results thinking, and really push that forward instead of having multiple different frameworks. I think that might be something that could improve. And sort of doing that, really aligning it with at the partner country level to what they're trying to achieve. Another thing that I wanted to mention, I don't know how many of you were at the meeting in July, the I can't even say it, GPEDC, so many different letters, in July, which was organized in connection to the SDG HLPF. And there, I think somehow the debate was much more lively than I had expected. Civil society were very active, and they were, in particular, a lot of Southern civil society, and they were sort of saying this is a very relevant agenda for them, and that they feel that this is a process where they can participate. And I think that's an important thought, not to lose that. And there seemed to be, I think, more ideas of how to really at the practical level move forward, and sort of maybe move a little bit away from some of the very big high-level thoughts.
Thank you very much. Gargi, could I turn to you now? Because I think in a way, if you think about the work of the Gates Foundation, a lot of it has been initially around global health and trying to focus on promoting better outcomes in that. And in a way, it's quite interesting to see how that sits alongside the sort of aid effectiveness as traditionally defined. So, because you're very focused on results and outcomes, but they may not necessarily be the same measures of results and outcomes. And it'd be interesting to sort of get your take on how you see this conversation.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me and the panel. It is a live issue for us, so I'm glad to be talking about it. I think despite the slightly different role in the world, perhaps the view we share with other donors, and hopefully in this conversation, is that ODA is a unique resource in the development finance architecture, and that it is fairly uniquely placed to reach the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable. So through that lens, the idea that there should be special principles that guide the use of this very scarce and precious resource really does resonate, has always resonated. I don't think we were in Rome. The foundation would have been a baby, but we were in Paris and Busan and Accra, and we're the first philanthropic foundation to report our spending to the OECD as part of the move on transparency. So, when I did go back and look at the principles, and at their core, transparency, managing for results, country ownership, it's hard not to think of those as sound guidelines for our business. But of course, we're all in agreement that times are changing, and those changes are well known. I tend to think about them as sort of new places, new actors, new issues. So new places or old places where we haven't solved yet, middle-income countries, and then increasingly fragile contexts. New actors, China, private sector. New issues for us are really important, whether that's pandemics or climate. Global public goods feel ever more important than they have been. Technology is an increasingly important issue that certainly countries where we work are wrestling with. How to use technology to maximize impact and equity, demographic transitions. So these are challenges that require different ways of working than traditional models. So 4 suggestions for how we might think about updating this conversation. First, spending enough as much as spending well is on our minds. I think there was a time when we thought spending enough was sort of assumed and done, and we could focus on ever better. Matthew and Satu, I think, represent governments who are at the forefront of leaders in continuing to commit to ODA, but that's not true everywhere. Certainly in this country, we are worried again about spending enough. So that, I think, is part of the story again. Second, I think targeting more effectively is very much on our minds. So, something like geocoding projects allows us to understand who is benefiting from aid, where aid is being spent well, and perhaps where it doesn't need to be, where it could be replaced by other sources of finance. I know the World Bank and African Development Bank are at the forefront of geocoding. I think that's something that, that deserves more attention. I think how ODA deals with blended finance and the push toward blending is a really important issue that can't be ignored. We need to be serious about the role blended finance can and cannot play in reaching the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable. There's a sort of excitement about it, but it's also very hard to do and hard to get right. Just one number here, the OECD data, I think from 2012 to 17 or 18, of $150 billion mobilized in development finance, only about 12 billion of that went to low-income countries. And most of that infrastructure, financial sector, manufacturing, all the places you'd expect. So the excitement about blending for some of the issues we work on really in human capital and human development is less clear. And finally, I'll just close with a question about forums. In my mind, I don't know if we're in a world anymore where a single set of best practices will apply to all actors and all situations, and whether that's even the right aspiration. What I miss more is a robust forum where all of those actors show up and care and engage in the conversation about how to do our business well. So I would sort of put that to the room about an alternative to rigid principles and more about how do we create that place. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think that last question that you put on the table is one that we should come back to. Where is this conversation going to take place? And actually, what's the framing of that conversation in a way? Ian, you've listened to all this. I presume you have a set of ready-made now
Answers.
Yeah, exactly. The
answers that you
answer
will
is
provide.
So thank you very much, Masood. It's a pleasure to be here in this distinguished panel. So my real interest in this probably started 15 months ago when I was talking to a head of an agency, and I said I've got a very cool idea about how we can assess the evaluation capacity of your organisation, thinking about accountability. I think I've got a new way to measure it, and you'll be very interested. And he said, Ian, honestly, I don't care. My minister, he doesn't put pressure on me to respond to these indicators. The Paris is dead. I wouldn't say this publicly, and it's not anyone on this panel. I should hasten to add. It was a he. I'll give you that. And I was stunned, and I thought that's so interesting. Here we are with the flagship report of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation due out. Surveys of 150 countries responding to how these countries are doing, and here I am being told by an agency head that it doesn't matter. So that got me thinking a bit about the political economy of this as well as the technical dimensions of it. And I suppose, as Masood has set out, there are some objections to this agenda now. Maybe there are new actors in this sphere that don't recognise aid, let alone aid effectiveness, that we need to worry about. There's the rise of fragility, there's the different instruments. But I think some of those perhaps some of our worries about that go too far. So we're doing new work on how much concessional development finance there is globally from the new actors, from the traditional actors. And, the traditional actors are still giving 80% of concessional finance globally. And, that 160 or $70 billion or so, that matters enormously to developing countries. It's 10% of the GDP of low-income countries. So I'm with Gargi. Volume still absolutely matters, but the volume has been flat, and so the effectiveness matters. Now, I said Satu's raised the July meeting, which I watched a bit of online, and it was very warm and it was excellent. But within that, there was a PDF report talking about performance of donors against the principles, and some of it was remarkable. It wasn't remarked on, but it was remarkable. There was across the donor community no progress on transparency since 2016, less use of public finance systems, regression on predictability, on use of results frameworks, and a reduction in the amount of parliamentary scrutiny happening in recipient countries. Now, as Matthew's hinted, the measures underpinning those findings are not perfect by any means, and I'll come back to that briefly. But I think it's striking that here is the organisation and the big annual flagship meeting to discuss aid effectiveness, and those things haven't really made it out of the PDF of the results. So really, I mean, what that leads me to conclude in a way is, GPEDC, which broadened its focus on actors and brought in the civil society organisations, the net effect is really there's less scrutiny now on donors than there was when the Paris survey was established 15 years ago, and I don't think that's right. Now, another challenge is, is this all part of the kind of failed Washington consensus that we should have these principles and a bunch of indicators, and that's how we assess our aid? And I only think it's one part of the architecture. With the Nobel Prizes this week, we've seen that's another part. Randomised control trials have got their part to play. Macroeconomic stability has got its part to play. But I think having a dashboard of indicators where we can compare our donors, to see whether they give to poor countries, to see whether they give transparency, and to look at those things relatively, which is what the GPEDC isn't able to do as a UN agency. I think that's important, and I think we should be doing more. So my three, recommendations here. I mean, I think at the political level, Gargi's absolutely right. We need to see more resources going into this, and if the principles need revisiting, then ministers should lead that conversation, I think, at the political level, and if we need different principles. At the official level, and what we're talking about here, I think the fact that the indicators are weak, is a reflection upon us as officials. I say that I was an official at the time, as officials in the effort, resources and focus that we put in the measures. We still haven't got good measures of how the countries that we provide the aid to feel about that aid. That's the bottom line. So as we renew the GPEDC survey next January, I hope donors will step up with the resources and the focus to make sure in 2 years we have got robust indicators and we're not arguing about the number of countries that have responded and how reliably. And then for civil society, I think that my recommendation is, and I think we have to hold donors to account on this. And I think that CGD will do its part with putting together what we think are the best suite of indicators that we've got. And I hope other organisations will engage with that and will challenge their governments on the results of those indicators and engage in conversations about whether they tell you something really about improving practice and creating the right incentives.
Thank you. I know, Matthew, you have to leave in a few minutes. I'm aware of that. But I wanted to sort of ask, and maybe come to you first because you might have to leave. So you mentioned that, for example, when a new index comes out and you're a bit lower down, the people look into the reason and sort of say, well, it doesn't really matter. For example, you do less budget support, and you could say the reason for this is the following. And I think today I would argue most people do less budget support than was the case 15 years ago. 15 years ago, people thought increasing the share of budget support was good, but then now, partly because the countries they're involved in or partly for other reasons, they're doing less. And yet the indices are still measuring that as one way. So one conversation is, I'd like to get your view on others, is should we put energy into trying to figure out what are the right new set of indices? Does it matter? Is it a good exercise? And would it be quite different indices for different purposes for which people are, or different circumstances in which people are providing assistance? So you might say that if you're working in fragile states, not the same set of indices as if you're working in other economies, or if you're supporting global public goods, you'd have a different set of indices. Is that, in your view, a sort of useful exercise, or do you feel actually the question really is the one that Gargi asked, which was, how do we find ways to ask the question of how are we using this very limited, precious resource effectively? And that might lead you to indices, might lead you to other ways to think about it. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, sorry that I do have to go in a few minutes, but it's a fascinating debate. I've already taken loads of notes on my pad here, and I will find out what the bit of I missed afterwards. So I think exactly as you said, Masoudi, I think you've interpreted what I was trying to say about general budget support exactly the right way, which is that it's a good thing that we no longer do development in this way, because it means that countries have progressed typically countries have progressed from the point where that was a sensible thing to do. And so we should be celebrating that, not sort of marking us down for the fact that we've done that. That's the point that I was trying to make. So yes, the indicators, the measures within the indexes are not fully up to date. That's the challenge. I think that you're right, that we probably do need different indicators for different purposes, or maybe for different types of countries. And what we are increasingly doing inside DFID is thinking about what we call country typographies, different types of countries out there. So there are fragile and conflict-affected states. What we are seeking to do there is very different from what we're doing in a very poor but stable country, which is very different again from what we're trying to do in a country that's close to moving on from aid, and where it's all about jobs and investment and if you like, a more normal partnership of equals. The types of activity in those three types of countries, just to name three, are very different from each other. So having a sophisticated set of indicators would be great. Personally, I would rather that we focused on things that are already out there as measures. So there's no shortage of goals and targets and objectives. I mean, just within the SDGs, you've got 17 goals and 169 targets. So perhaps we could use them or a subset of them rather than creating our own different set of indicators yet again, at least for between now and 2030. I think that would be a very valuable thing to do. And then perhaps you just need one or two things which are about, if you like, the quality of the development assistance, the quality of the relationship between the different partners involved.
So does that resonate with your thinking? Do you go about it differently?
Yeah, it does. I think exactly sort of basing more on the SDGs, I think, in the results work, I think would really make a lot of sense. I think in a way maybe the big focus on results that we've had in past years may have taken us actually away from some of the principles, because we were all sort of building our own sort of accountability system. So if we can collaborate more based on that, and particularly at the country level, we've been actually ourselves trying to do that. Now we're going through our own, sort of trying to see if we can build for our own program a set of indicators that are based on SDGs. And it's not straightforward, but I think that would be the way to go forward. But I mean, I don't fully agree with having a lot of different sets of indicators and indices. I understand that we have to recognize that circumstances are different in different countries, and therefore activities may be different. But if we really would like to boil it down to some core principles of good behavior, then I'm not really sure how much differentiation you would like to have, because you may end up in this endless process of coming up with indicators and another endless process of trying to understand what they are, and then they won't really get used. So I would probably have fewer, but then have them more deeply rooted in the country realities and driven by the countries themselves. I think that would be the way I would go.
If I can turn to you so you listened to two views on how to proceed. So from where you sit, what are the things that you would want to see as a Minister of Finance, as a recipient of some of this aid, to say, is this effective or is this ineffective? I mean, how would you like to measure the relative performance of the different donors?
Because actually we are dealing with, or we aspire to deal with so many donors, this will be a very challenging tasks. But I think,
excluding the present, of course, we can just assume they're all effective. So
this is an early pitch for our partners and donors to come to Sudan. I think really it depends. I think I pretty much agree with the speakers before me. That pretty much depends on the nature of the actors and their comparative advantages. For example, drawing from the case of Sudan, in what we call the three areas. These are the areas that are most affected by conflicts. Darfur, Southern Kordofan, and Southern Blue Nile. The NGOs, for example, have really done very well in terms of building localized social capital, in terms of, for example, promoting agricultural productivity in a smallholders situation, in terms of, for example, building, say, like, projects for water harvesting and then using that to improve, performance of agriculture and providing farmers with new technologies and so on. And then using that as an instrument to build some social capital in a localized way. And in that sense, I think these kind of interventions would be much easier to measure in terms of effectiveness. But I think also other donors are more concerned of kind of bonding the social capital, operating on a much larger scale. And that obviously cannot be measured by simple kind of metrics. It does require a little bit much more, elaborate and perhaps less, less transparent or less kind of measurable approaches, such as, for example, helping the Ministry of Finance to manage liquidity, or the central bank to stabilize monetary policy or inflation or something like that. So I think I pretty much agree that actually the measure of effectiveness should have to be specific to the type of intervention and also the nature of the donors. Right now, our main concern in Sudan really is to build upon this kind of localized, projects that have been honed and developed over time by a number of donors who have, different interests, and how to actually coordinate these initiatives and to bond this by, for example, improving the health services, social services, building markets so that, these activities can actually, become sustainable so that they can be linked to markets and so on. While at the same time, we know that we need to fix the macroeconomy, we need to work with the IMF and the World Bank and so on. And for us, that is obviously very important, but I think the immediate concern really is to target, for example, the peace process, that actually we have a peace process going on the political side. How can we, for example, augment that and reinforce that through changing the lives of the individuals who are most affected. And I think that's very important, but eventually, in the medium term, sustainability requires that we think about the big picture.
Right. Good. I want to, if it's all right with the panelists, I'd like to bring in now people from the audience, unless there's something you wanted to add at this stage. And I'd like to encourage people to, as I say, make any comments they have, but also to ask any questions, and we'll take them in groups. So let me start first with Sufyan there. I had first, yeah, please. Yeah, somebody's going to bring a mic to you. And then, Andrew.
Thank you. Short comment. At the beginning, you said the role of AIDS in overall development financing is really not that much big. This is generally true. But when you look into some specific countries, particularly in Africa, aid is still critically important. So we should not really undermine, we could not generalize. Second, for those countries like Ethiopia, the overall development financing is not that big, but in certain sectors, the development aids, the resource from partners are critical. I can mention the health sector in Ethiopia. So we should not really forget about this. Second is those 5 principles, the Paris Declaration, I happen to be involved. And when I still look in those 5 principles, they are still valid as a guide. It says ownership without really countries truly own and coordinate the donors, the effectiveness will not be there. So the ownership is still valid. Then we have alignment and harmonizations. Very, very important. I'm sure the minister will immediately face the challenge of really to coordinate fragmentations and so on and so forth. So this alignment and harmonization is still very at the country level valid. Managing for results, the way we see is still very, we should focus still the challenge is the same. Challenges are poverty, unemployment, delivery of basic services still there. And finally, mutual accountability is still valid. What changes over the years are really players are changed. There are also some changes. So we need to really continue to push for this aid effectiveness, but under a new context.
Thank you very much, Sufyan. And of course, you have the experience of managing this as a minister for many, many years. So I think Andrew Rogerson in the front row there was next.
Hello, I'm Andrew Rogerson. I help Ian on this agenda as a visiting fellow here, but I've also worked on this subject for many years. I was curious as and it would have been nice to hear from DFID, but I think we can infer from some of the answers. What is the internal culture within your various agencies? And I think I can also speak, also ask the question of the Minister of Finance, in terms of what is the competitive edge in quality that you're looking for. Now, I may have heard you, Minister, speak about speed and reliability and also being able to operate across a very wide spectrum of problems that coexist. I heard very much flexibility coming from the DFID side. When you look across at the behavior of others, such as it might be reflected in an index produced by CGD or anybody else, what resonates in terms of what you'd like to compare yourself to others, on what dimension? And don't say results on the ground, because you don't know that in advance. You won't know it for quite a long time. But what kind of behaviors do you think you would like to check yourself against others and compete?
That's a very good question. So in a way, it would be, I'll come back to the two of you particularly on that, because in a way, what are you exhorting your staff to do more of? And who are you, I mean, when you look at your peers, you'd say, well, look at the way they were able to do X rather than, and what does X look like? And I think I had next gentleman in the front row here, and then
I'm Bob Hershey, I'm a consultant. What is being done to get more transparency, such as by having online meetings to get an economic consensus of the donors and the recipients?
more transparency. Let me take one more just behind you.
Hi, I'm Dalgan from Mongolia. Just building also on the previous question, I want to ask, what is the role of the development industry that has been created in the last, I don't know how many years, which overtakes the place of some national stakeholders that creates sometimes some frustration in developing countries where the development is designed by the North, delivered by the Northern companies or large development industry actors, and some of you also mentioned, accountable to the taxpayers of those developed countries. So where is the role of the national and local kind of stakeholders in this whole effectiveness discussion?
Thank you. That's also a very good question. So maybe we just stop at that and do one round of responses on that. And maybe just if I could, before I say, I think Sufyan's first comment that it's still very important, even though it's small. I think it's quite interesting that everybody starts off by saying that aid is really not that important, then makes a really strong pitch about why they need a bit more of it. You know, why they, the particular, whether it's a sector, a theme, a group proposing it. So, you know, now I talk to people, and so there's a very strong community of people who think that development assistance is really best deployed to promote private financing. If you could only deploy a bit more in promoting private financing, it would have a really high payoff. And then there's others who think if you could only deploy a bit more to support middle-income countries to make the right decisions on infrastructure, that would be a really high payoff. And then there is a community who feel very strongly that if you could only deploy a bit more in support of the work we do in fragile states, that would really have the best payoff. And I think what I feel is that these conversations are happening without any frame in which you can make rational trade-offs. And so I think that's why it does seem to me that, you know, this is worth taking forward. But that's a bit of an aside. And so come back to the question that was posed. What is it that you're exhorting your staff to do more of? Satu and Gagi first, I think.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Well, I still think.
Yep, sure, I'm happy to. Well, Andrew, of course, I was going to say results, so you pulled the rug right out from under me. But actually, you know, I don't think I'm alone in saying what we're trying to do is find proxies for results along the way, right? Because it is a sort of relentless focus on results that drives us, and we're trying to understand how to know when we're on that path and not. So a couple of examples. First of all, you know, in terms of the feedback that matters most to us, I don't know if we're objects of these indices or not, but, you know, if I think about some of the most powerful feedback that we've received in the past decade or so, it is direct from governments. If they are telling us, we are with you, we are aligned in mission, and you are not doing the best we want in terms of being partners with us. So we had a government tell us that the way we were showing up in our hyper-specialized way to talk about malaria and then child illness and then something else was actually impeding their attempts to build a strong health system. And we completely revamped the way we work with not only that government, but across the board, and the way we think about the health system overall. So that's a really powerful indicator that we take seriously. I think it's directly related to results. And then there are, you know, a series of other kind of measurements along the way that we try and drive toward. I think the other piece that we try to take seriously, and it speaks a bit to the question you raised, we aren't another official donor, and I think that at times feels that it has weaknesses, but the strength is also that we should be better able to mobilize different constituencies in the way we spend our resources and in the way we show up and how we share our voice with local constituencies and countries. And so, you know, today our footprint in India and Nigeria is very much about working in partnership with local philanthropists. It's our funding patterns are very much to local women's economic empowerment groups, to local NGOs. Even while we try to work alongside the government at the systems level, we're very much trying to bring the coalition of actors that I think today feels more relevant, private sector, for the work we're trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a difficult one. I think, first of all, I think one shift that has happened in, at least for us and probably some other donors as well, that there is increasingly, we use multilateral channels and other intermediaries rather than are engaged in programs at the country level ourselves. And that sort of the share of what in the DAC context is called the country programmable aid, that has diminished quite considerably. And therefore, for us, I think one of the key issues really is how do we make sure that multilateral organizations are on their best behavior at the country level, that they are coordinated, that they respect local ownership and so on. But so if you think about what do we drive our staff to do more of, it is in that context. So it's not only designing and delivering projects, but it is very much sort of as a financier of other organizations' activities to quite a large extent. One thing that we have that we try to do to be good at and sometimes succeed and not always is predictability in terms of being a good partner. We get usually good feedback at the country level in our evaluations, for example, that we are a predictable partner. We're a good partner in terms of bringing our views honestly to the table and also listening to local views. So I think that's something we really want to do more of and improve on, even if we at times have succeeded quite well as well. And another thing where we are a very small player in the big world, we really try to focus on where we can bring value rather than trying to be involved everywhere. And this applies to both, of course, multilateral work, but also at the country level. We are very focused on a few sectors, a few activities where we then want to bring value. And for example, some of our projects, I think at best, and where we would like to push our staff to do more of, is when you find in an area or in a sector a sort of a niche where you can bring a new way of doing something, and then that can be adopted by others. For example, in Ethiopia, we have quite a good examples of, for example, doing a cost-efficient water sector arrangement where that has then been subsequently adopted by the government. And I think that's where we feel most proud that, okay, we really made a difference. We've provided some tools that can then be used and taken forward.
Ian, did you say something?
Yeah, let me just say something brief, picking up on some of the really interesting comments that we had and from the comments from the Minister. And I think what I take away from let me start with the accountability part, but I want to come to the ownership part. But on accountability, I think owner is different, both because it's precious and because there's no democratic accountability for that money because it's spent in countries that don't have the parliamentary systems to oversee it. So that justifies an extra level of scrutiny, I think. And I think that what I've taken away from the comments in the audience and the challenges that the Minister faces, I mean, they're very context specific. I mean, they're very particular, they need to be flexible and tailored and so on. And how can you measure that from afar? Well, I think the answer comes in ownership. So I think the key takeaway for me from this is just getting a really strong grip on whether the partners in the development projects that we're undertaking, have we got reliable information from those partners on whether they're getting the right sort of aid? And I think that is a gap, and I think that is my big takeaway, that we need to fill that gap with good information, both conversationally, but also quantitatively, because we need to look at how everybody's doing and think about the effectiveness of multilaterals to check that they're also building those partnerships in the way that we want.
Okay, now I think a gentleman over there, lady over there, we'll take one more round of questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panelists for some really intriguing dialogue. I'm probably one of the nerdy, wonky types that really likes this aid effectiveness discussion.
Good company here,
I think. I just want to comment two things on what I've just heard, but also on this question of relevance. And to start with the question of relevance, I want to acknowledge how profoundly the aid effectiveness discussion has changed our behavior and our practice. I was at Paris, I was at Accra, I coordinated the USG participation in Busan, and I think one of the reasons why we don't talk about it quite as much anymore is because it has become part of the way that we do business now. We recently acquired a puppy, and the puppy barked all the time and chewed on things all the time, and we took it to a puppy school, and where we were really educated much more than the puppy was. And now the puppy doesn't have that bad behavior, and we don't talk about it anymore. So I think in part, I'm sorry, that's kind of a flip metaphor, but the notion that the aid effectiveness dialogue has profoundly changed our behavior, I think, is very important to realize. And I've been listening for the last decade to how aid is less relevant than it was before. And when people cite why, they usually talk about the numbers, that it used to be 80-20 and now it's 20-80. Well, this 20%, or however much it is right now, $160 billion, is the most scrutinized, the most evaluated and assessed contribution to assistance in the world. And we have much less information about the impact of the other 80%. At least we're all striving for some sort of positive development outcome. And I think that is also attributable to this at first nascent but now institutionalized dialogue over aid effectiveness. So I'm not that worried that it's not discussed in those terms as much anymore, because I think it has had a profound effect on how we do business.
That's a good perspective. There's a lady over here. There you are.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. So we've been talking about entering this new age of aid and organizations focusing more on agility and adaptability. But a lot of times we're trying to move these giant organizations, whether it be DFID or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I was hoping you could either give me examples or talk a little bit more about how you're implementing these into your organizations. And then, Minister, if you can talk about if you think that this kind of agility would be beneficial to you as someone on the other side. Thanks.
Okay, I'll take one more question, then start with Ibrahim, because I think, yes, because the lady over there, yeah.
Hi. I guess I'm interested in hearing from the panel what your thoughts are on whether we need to revisit the fundamental purpose of ODA and reflect that more at the start, so that in re-questioning or revisiting the various principles and the proliferation of indices, we don't have to agree on one that works for everything, but we leave that, as Minister was saying, to the comparative advantage of donors or sectors, and they'll be different in different interventions, but at least from the outset, we have, I don't want to call them principles, but some sort of indicators of measures that we know that the way that we're allocating ODA is reflective of the potential of activities to progress the poorest first.
Okay. We'll go right to ground level and restart from the principles, of the purposes you're saying. All right, I'll turn to you first, Ibrahim, because I know you have to leave in a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think, I don't think there is a particular issue, but I would like to just raise a question or a challenge that countries like Sudan, coming out of, certain types of regime that has never been developmental, that have, mismanaged the economy and the politics and so on, and including triggering civil wars and conflicts. There is some sort of a political economic consideration here from the perspective of donors that affect the recipient countries. And here particularly the potential disconnect between humanitarian aid and development aid. Because actually I can see that there are some bodies and institutions that have been taking the larger role in terms of humanitarian aid, and it might not be easy for them to let go, to allow transition from humanitarian to development aid. And since actually resources are limited, and usually they tend to be seen as constituting a trade-off, like for example, a certain institution might say, yeah, but we are actually supporting livelihood support and providing basic needs and so on, and we don't really have the resources. Some other donors might actually take the real role on this development aid. So I think this might constitute a problem in the sense that the timeliness of transition from humanitarian to development aid would be really, a challenge given the, some sort. It's not a vested interest, but some sort of being used to actually dealing with a certain type of aid and building institutional expertise around it and so on. It makes it harder for the recipient countries to make a case that now we are ready to actually transit from humanitarian aid, give it to us, give it through the government so that the government can actually focus more on sustainable development, so to speak.
Gargi.
Want to move down line? Sure. Yep. So I think I'll take that last question. And my answer is a very clear no. I do not think we should revisit the fundamental purpose of aid, nor the definition of ODA. Having lived through the past couple of years where that was challenged and debated, I don't think we would, in today's environment, get a better definition that was more forward-leaning for the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable. So, when I think about the core definition of ODA around concessionality, around purpose, I think that still is extraordinarily valid today. And, if we think that, for the most part, the core of the effectiveness principles have been internalized in the community, then I certainly don't think that we should take the demise of a conference series, if you will, to be any commentary on the relevance, the continued relevance of aid.
So can I just ask you one question? When you say that shouldn't revisit the basic purpose, would you say also that the basic purpose and definition, in fact, allows us to do most of the things that we would like to do with ODA today, and there's enough, it's broad enough in scope that if we were to go about and kind of define the sort of follow through from it, we'd cover most of what we would like to do?
That's certainly my impression and the Foundation's impression. I know there are people who've been in the weeds of the definitions and how it's evolving and the measurement of concessionality, but from an operational perspective, absolutely.
Because I think that's actually quite an interesting point, which is, there is a view that, I think the one that you articulated, you say, look, the aid has changed so much, how we use it, it's time to go back and re-examine the purpose. And I think there's the other view, which Gargi just outlined, which I support, because I think that at this stage, to try and open up the basic purpose would get us into a long discussion, the net result of which wouldn't necessarily be any better and may actually be worse than doing a somewhat more focused effort to try to define how you would define the follow-up, the implications of the existing purpose, but in ways that are adapted to what we are trying to do today. And actually, one good thing may come from it is to define some things that don't fit in by any standard. It's also useful to be able to say, actually, really, there's no rational way in which you should be spending ODA on this purpose. But there are probably quite a few things at the moment which some people think is good to spend ODA on and others don't, but about which it would be useful to have a conversation without reopening the basic purpose. I think that's a sort of, it's almost like a tactical thing rather than a basic objective thing. But Satu, what?
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with sort of that that line of thinking that ODA, it continues to be important. I fully agree with those that have said it, and there are many purposes for which it is a unique resource. On the other hand, I think it is also useful to try and capture impacts and flows that are beyond the ODA definition without sort of compromising that ODA. And I'm thinking, for example, about partners that are not part of OECD or are not reporting against it. And then also, for example, impacts of blended finance or other types of investments. How do you then capture that in a useful way? But I wanted to comment on the point that the agenda has actually made a huge difference, and I partly agree with that. There are a lot of a lot of practices that, for example, we follow that are stemming from this work. For example, working on sector-based programs that are fully government-owned in the partner country and so on. A lot of coordination happening, and there's, I think, the old story of sort of all kinds of overlapping projects all over the place is less the case these days. However, I don't think we've cured the problem. There are areas where this still continues to happen. So I think it's not completely done, but I think that it has had an impact. And then the question on adaptability and flexibility. We struggle, I think, ourselves. We're a small donor, and therefore our budgets also tend to be not that flexible. What we then try to do is to focus or to use unearmarked multi-year funding with our multilateral partners so that they then can react to changing circumstances. And in particular, of course, this is very important in the humanitarian area, where it's important that organizations are able to react quickly. But it's not an easy solution, and the minister spoke about humanitarian and development and bringing those together and making sure you don't mix them in a way that's unhelpful, but you make them work together in a way that's helpful. It's quite difficult to do in practice.
So Ian, I think it'd be interesting for you to react to the argument that actually reason people don't talk about it is because there's no problem anymore, right? I mean, it's kind of been sorted, largely changed our behavior.
It's nice to see a geek in the audience, but it's a shame I disagree with a geek, as geeks do. But seriously, I mean, I think that look up the July report of the GPEDC and look at the indicators across the piece, and they don't tell a good story. I haven't just cherry picked the bad ones. There's not a good story there. The EU and the US still tie their aid. I mean, we know that that's ineffective. So I don't think that argument has been one at all. And I think that, in a sense, is an illustration of the problem. It's just not widely understood enough, and there's just not enough scrutiny on some of these, these key, relatively high-level metrics. In my view, I think on the ODA question, there is this impending conversation about what aid is for. I agree with Masood. I mean, and the ODA rules are defined by the countries that spend the ODA. I mean, so they're not perfect. There's things in there that I don't think are concessional enough to be there, but I can live with it. I guess the elephant in the room is climate mitigation. So there's a ongoing discussion, I think, about whether aid that's spent on climate mitigation is well spent, and whether the mitigation that's achieved by that amount of money can compete with the idea of vaccination or helping human welfare on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's, as we understand the impacts of climate change better, that debate will run. I think this is where I might want to talk about the purpose of ODA. The 0.7% target was agreed in 1950 by rich countries, well before climate change was understood. The stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere were created by the industrial countries. So the idea that we should use the concessional pot of money for countries to catch up to address a problem that's created by the rich countries and continues to be, I think, is a misplaced responsibility. But I think the practical reality will be that we'll have to decide whether spending aid on climate mitigation could that become the best use of aid if we think climate change is so serious for the poorest. We'll have to see what the evidence says about that, I think.
So I think it'd be a good point on which to end is asking people in the room, how many of you think that some portion of ODA could legitimately be spent on climate mitigation? It'd be great if those of you who think that climate mitigation is a legitimate use of ODA money could raise their hands. As opposed to what we spend it on now, the variety of things.
But we're spending it on mitigation.
Does anybody in this room think that it would be so I have at least one brave soul, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's kind of interesting that I would venture, and I leave this to you without...
You might have some abstentions.
So you might
I mean, you should ask the other question.
On the fence people don't count on this. So I would venture that if we were to ask the same question in a session that we were doing on climate finance with about the same sized audience, there'd be 6 people that would think it wasn't a good idea. And therefore, I do feel that, whether I don't think it's a question of whether you get to the purpose or whether you don't get to the purpose. So it's not a process issue, but as a substantive conversation, I do feel that the question of whether and to what extent it is an appropriate use of development assistance for purposes other than the ones that we have traditionally used it for is going to be a live conversation. Of course, it goes well beyond aid effectiveness, but I think it does raise a set of questions that we could perhaps have a debate on at the spring meetings. Bring first some people who would make a strong case as to why it makes sense for ODA to be spent on climate, and some who would say that it would completely negate the foundational principles for which ODA was established, and see where we go from there. So with that, can I ask you to please join me in thanking our panelists for their Stay tuned.
Thank you.